Time is supposed to be a constant, linear, unchangeable, past, present, future, flowing in one direction like a river that can never be reversed. But here in Archive 7, I've learned that time isn't a river. It's a web, and some objects know how to pull the strings. My name is Mr. Keeper, and after discovering the truth about Project Convergence, after seeing Dr. Chen's final message, I've become obsessed with one terrifying question. If the network has been planning this for 70 years, if they can predict and control human behavior so precisely, do they also control time itself? 3 days have passed since I found Dr. Chen's hidden files. 3 days since I learned about the global conspiracy that's been reshaping our world. But something strange is happening. I'm finding evidence that the network didn't just predict the future, they've been manipulating it. Today I'm going to show you objects that don't just exist in time, they control it. Objects that can show you tomorrow's news before it happens. Reverse the aging of anything they touch. Photograph events that haven't occurred yet. Objects that prove time isn't the fixed constant we thought it was. But there's something else. Something that's been keeping me awake for the past 3 nights. One of these objects has shown me something that changes everything. Something that suggests my time here at Archive 7 is running out faster than I thought. The network isn't just preparing for the convergence. They're accelerating it. And according to what I've seen, I have exactly 3 weeks before everything changes forever. But first, let me show you how I know this. Let me show you objects that have been documenting the future for over a century. Objects that have been preparing for this moment long before any of us were born. Object 0947, the Tomorrow newspaper. This appears to be a standard copy of a London Times, dated September 15th, 1924. But there's something impossible about this newspaper. It was purchased on September 14th, 1924. It prints tomorrow's news today. The newspaper belonged to Harold Morrison, a newsstand owner in Westminster who discovered its properties purely by accident. On the morning of September 14th, 1924, Morrison was arranging his usual delivery of newspapers when he noticed something strange. One copy of the Times bore tomorrow's date, September 15th, but he was certain it hadn't been there the night before. Morrison initially assumed it was a printing error, but when he opened the paper to check, he found complete news coverage of events that hadn't happened yet. Parliamentary debates that were scheduled for later that day. Stock market closings that wouldn't occur for another 18 hours. Weather reports for a storm that hadn't yet reached London. Thinking it was an elaborate hoax, Morrison decided to keep the newspaper and compare it to the following day's actual events. When September 15th arrived, Morrison bought a regular copy of the Times and compared it to the mysterious newspaper from the day before. They were identical. Every headline, every story, every advertisement. The impossible newspaper had printed the future with perfect accuracy, down to the smallest detail. Morrison began experimenting with the newspaper, documenting its properties in a journal that we acquired along with the object. He discovered that the newspaper updated itself every day at exactly midnight, replacing the previous day's future news with the next day's future news. It was like having a 24-hour window into tomorrow. But Morrison also discovered something disturbing. The newspaper didn't just predict the future, it influenced it. When he read about events that hadn't happened yet, he found himself unconsciously taking actions that helped make those events occur. For example, on September 20th, 1924, the newspaper reported that a fire would destroy Henderson's bakery on Morrison Street. Morrison read this in the morning and spent the day unconsciously making decisions that contributed to the fire. He delayed calling the fire department when he smelled smoke. He forgot to mention to Henderson that he'd seen electrical problems in the bakery's basement. He positioned himself perfectly to witness the fire when it occurred. Morrison realized that the newspaper wasn't just showing him the future, it was using him to create the future it showed. He had become an unwitting agent of temporal manipulation, ensuring that tomorrow's news would become today's reality. Dr. Chen's research on this object revealed something even more disturbing. She found that the newspaper had been documenting the network's activities for decades, printing stories about paranormal events, government cover-ups, and global conspiracies 24 hours before they happened. More importantly, she discovered that the newspaper had been printing stories about Archive 7 staff members for years. Stories about researchers who would disappear, administrators who would have accidents, security personnel who would suffer mental breakdowns. And everyone who read these stories about themselves found themselves unconsciously fulfilling the newspaper's predictions. 3 weeks ago, the newspaper printed a story about me. The headline read, "Archive, 7 Keeper exposed global conspiracy, flees facility under mysterious circumstances." The article described how I would discover classified files, reveal the truth about Project Convergence, and ultimately be forced to abandon my position to avoid capture by network operatives. The article was dated exactly 3 weeks from today. Since reading that story, I found myself unconsciously taking actions that move me toward that predicted future. I've been more careless with security protocols. I've been documenting information that I know I shouldn't. I've been preparing for a departure that I consciously never planned. The newspaper isn't just predicting my future, it's creating it. And I'm powerless to stop myself from fulfilling its prophecy. But the most terrifying part is what the newspaper printed yesterday. Tomorrow's headline, for a day that hasn't arrived yet. Archive, 7 Keeper missing. Facility enters emergency lockdown. The article describes how I will disappear sometime tonight, leaving behind only these video recordings and a facility in chaos. The newspaper has never been wrong, not once in a century. And according to its prediction, I have less than 18 hours before my time at Archive. 7 ends forever. Object 0618, the Ashworth reverse clock. This ornate mantle clock belonged to the same Ashworth family whose pocket watch I showed you in episode 2. But while that watch manipulated time to serve its owner's desires, this clock has a different relationship with time entirely. It runs backward, and everything near it ages in reverse. The clock was discovered in the Ashworth family estate in 1895, 1 year after Lord Edmund Ashworth's death. When the estate was being cleared, investigators found the clock in the library, ticking steadily backward. The hands moved counterclockwise, the chimes rang in reverse sequence, and the pendulum swung in the opposite direction from every other clock in the house. Initially, this was dismissed as a curiosity, a mechanical oddity that could be explained by some clever clockmaker's design. But then investigators began noticing changes in the library itself. Books that had been faded and worn when they first entered began to appear newer, their pages wider, their bindings tighter. Furniture that had shown decades of wear began to look as if it had just been crafted. Dr. Margaret Ashworth, Lord Edmund's widow, reported that she felt years younger whenever she spent time in the library. Her gray hair began to darken. Her wrinkles softened. Her energy increased. She initially attributed this to the relief of finally settling her husband's estate, but medical examinations confirmed the impossible. She was physically aging in reverse. The clock's effect extended to everything within approximately 20 feet of its location. Plants grew younger, flowers closed back into buds, fruit ripened in reverse until it returned to its original state. Even photographs began to fade backward, slowly returning to blank paper. But the most disturbing discovery came when Dr. Ashworth decided to test the clock's limits. She brought in a dead flower, a rose that had been cut and dried weeks earlier. Within hours of being placed near the clock, the rose began to regain its color. Its petals unfurled, its stems straightened. The dead flower had been restored to life. Word of this discovery reached government authorities, who initially planned to study the clock's potential for medical applications. If the clock could reverse aging, could it cure disease? Could it heal injuries? Could it bring back the dead? The answer, according to classified research documents, was yes. But the process came with a price that made it unusable for any practical purpose. The clock didn't just reverse aging, it reversed everything. People who spent too much time near it began to lose memories in reverse chronological order. They forgot recent events first, then older memories, then childhood experiences. They regressed not just physically, but mentally, becoming younger in every sense until they ceased to exist entirely. Dr. Ashworth was the first victim. After 3 months of regular exposure to the clock, she had regressed to the physical age of 25. But she had also lost 30 years of memories. She couldn't remember her husband's death, her marriage, her adult life. She had become a 25-year-old woman with the life experience of a child. The research team tried to remove her from the clock's influence, but the process was irreversible. Dr. Ashworth continued to regress, losing more memories, becoming younger, until she had reverted to an infant. Then she simply disappeared. She had aged backward past the point of her own birth. The clock was removed from the Ashworth estate in 1896 and has been in government custody ever since. But its effects continue to baffle researchers. The clock seems to exist in a state of temporal inversion, experiencing time in reverse while everything around it flows forward. Dr. Chen's research suggested that the clock wasn't just running backward. It was connected to a parallel timeline where events occur in reverse order. A timeline where the convergence had already happened, where humanity had already been transformed, where the network's plan had already succeeded. According to her theories, the clock was showing us the reverse of our future. If we could understand how to read its temporal inversions, we could see what was coming and potentially prevent it. But 3 days ago, something changed. The clock stopped running backward. For the first time in over a century, it began ticking forward. Normal time, normal sequence, and everything in its vicinity began aging normally again. Dr. Chin's notes suggest that this change coincided with the beginning of the convergence phase, as if the clock had been waiting for this moment, counting down to it in reverse, and now that the moment had arrived, it could finally move forward with the rest of us. The clock's change confirms what I learned from Dr. Chen's files. The convergence isn't just beginning, it's been inevitable for over a century. The network has been working toward this moment since at least 1895, when the clock first appeared. They've been counting down to it, preparing for it, ensuring that when the moment arrived, everything would be ready. But the clock's change also suggests something else, something that fills me with hope even as it terrifies me. If the clock can reverse the aging process, if it can bring the dead back to life, if it can undo the effects of time itself, then maybe the convergence isn't as irreversible as the network believes. Maybe there's still time to change the future. Maybe there's still time to save humanity. But first, I need to show you something that suggests I might already be too late. Object 0759, the Hartwell Prophetic Camera. This camera belonged to Edmund Hartwell, a portrait photographer who operated a studio in London from 1920 to 1925. But Hartwell's camera didn't just capture images of the present. It photographed events that hadn't happened yet. The camera appears to be a standard Kodak view camera from the early 1920s, with a brass lens and mahogany body. But the photographs it produces show scenes from the future. Sometimes days, sometimes weeks, sometimes years ahead of when they were taken. Hartwell discovered the camera's unusual properties in March 1923 when he was photographing a family portrait. The Whitmore family, father, mother, and 2 young children, had come to his studio for a formal photograph. Hartwell set up the shot, focused the camera, and took what he thought was a standard portrait. But when he developed the photograph, something was wrong. The image showed the Whitmore family, but they were dressed in black mourning clothes. The father's face was gaunt and hollow. The mother was clearly pregnant, though she hadn't been during the sitting. And there was a 5th person in the photograph, an elderly man who hadn't been in the studio at all. Hartwell assumed the photograph was damaged or that he had accidentally created a double exposure. But 3 months later, he read in the newspapers that missed her. Whitmore had died suddenly of a heart attack. The funeral photograph in the obituary was identical to the image his camera had produced months earlier. Over the next 2 years, Hartwell experimented with the camera, documenting its properties in a journal that we acquired along with the object. He discovered that the camera could photograph events anywhere from 1 day to several years in the future. The time gap seemed to correlate with the emotional significance of the event. The more traumatic or important the future event, the further ahead the camera could see it. But Hartwell also discovered that the camera's predictions weren't just random glimpses of possible futures. They were warnings or instructions. Every photograph the camera produced showed an event that could still be prevented or altered, but only if the right actions were taken. For example, the camera photographed a fire that would destroy a church 6 months in the future. When Hartwell showed the photograph to the church's pastor, they were able to identify and repair the electrical problem that would have caused the fire. The disaster was prevented, and the photograph faded from the image, leaving only blank paper. Hartwell began to understand that the camera wasn't just showing him the future, it was giving him the opportunity to change it. but only if he was willing to act on what he saw. The camera's final photograph, taken in December 1925, showed Hartwell himself. He was older, thinner, wearing clothes he didn't own, standing in a room he had never seen. Behind him, barely visible in the shadows, were figures in dark robes. And in Hartwell's hand was a key, the same key that would later be classified as Object 0751, the Sterling Gallery key. The photograph was dated 15 years in the future, December 1940. It showed Hartwell as a much older man, clearly in distress, apparently being forced to hand over the key to the mysterious figures. But Hartwell never lived to see 1940. He died in January 1926, just 1 month after taking the photograph. The official cause of death was listed as a heart attack, but there were no witnesses, no medical examination, no investigation. He simply disappeared from his studio one night, and his body was found 3 days later in the Thames. The camera was acquired by government authorities in 1926, along with Hartwell's journal and all his photographs. For the next 90 years, it has been used by the network to document future events and plan their responses accordingly. Dr. Chin's research revealed that the camera had been photographing the convergence process for decades. Images of archive installations being constructed, of key personnel being recruited, of objects being discovered and acquired. The network has been using the camera to ensure that their 70-year plan would unfold exactly as designed. But 3 days ago, I decided to use the camera myself. I wanted to see what would happen to me after discovering the truth about Project Convergence. I want to know if I could prevent the future that the Tomorrow newspaper had predicted. I set up the camera in my quarters, focused it on myself, and took a photograph. When I developed the image, I saw something that confirmed my worst fears. The photograph showed me 3 weeks in the future, exactly the time frame predicted by the Tomorrow newspaper. But I wasn't fleeing archive, 7 as the newspaper had suggested. I was standing in a room I had never seen, surrounded by objects I didn't recognize. And I wasn't alone. Tommy was there, my 8-year-old son, looking exactly as he had the day he disappeared. But his eyes were different. They were older, knowing, filled with an intelligence that no child should possess. And he was smiling at me with an expression that was both loving and terrifying. Behind Tommy, I could see other figures. Dr. Chun, but changed somehow. Professor Williams, but not quite human anymore. And others, people I didn't recognize, but who seemed familiar, as if I had always known them. The photograph showed me 3 weeks from now, but not in this world. In the new place that Tommy had been calling to me about. The place where the network keeps the people who have undergone consciousness transfer. The camera had shown me my future. In 3 weeks, I would join the convergence. Not as a victim, but as a willing participant. The photograph showed me smiling, peaceful, accepting, as if I had chosen to become part of the network's plan. But here's what terrifies me most. I can feel it happening. Every day, the idea of joining Tommy becomes more appealing. Every night, his voice calling to me from the children's section becomes harder to resist. The photograph isn't just showing me the future, it's showing me what I'm going to choose. The camera has never been wrong. Just like the newspaper, its predictions always come true. And according to the photograph, in 3 weeks, I'll walk willingly into the network's embrace. But I'm not there yet. I still have 3 weeks to fight. 3 weeks to resist. 3 weeks to warn as many people as possible about what's coming. The question is, will it be enough? Time isn't what we thought it was. It's not a river flowing in one direction. It's a web that can be manipulated, reversed, predicted, and controlled. The network hasn't just been planning the convergence for 70 years. They've been watching it happen from the future, ensuring that every step unfolds exactly as designed. The objects I've shown you today prove that the network's power extends beyond physical reality, beyond human psychology, beyond even the boundaries of time itself. They've been orchestrating our fate from multiple temporal perspectives, creating a future that becomes more inevitable with each passing day. But there's something else, something that Dr. Chun discovered in her final weeks of research. The time-controlling objects aren't just tools, they're checkpoints. They're measuring the progress of the convergence, ensuring that everything happens on schedule. The Tomorrow newspaper documented the network's activities 24 hours before they occurred, giving operatives time to prepare and respond. The reverse clock counted down to the convergence in reverse, maintaining a temporal anchor point for when the process would begin. The Prophetic Camera photographed key moments years in advance, allowing the network to recruit the right people at the right times. But now all 3 objects have changed their behavior. The newspaper has stopped printing tomorrow's news. The clock has started running forward. The camera has begun showing images of the post-convergence world. These changes can only mean one thing. The network's temporal manipulation phase is complete. They no longer need to predict or control the future because the future has become the present. The convergence is happening now, and there's no longer any need for advance warning. I have 3 weeks. 3 weeks before the future captured in that photograph becomes reality. 3 weeks before I join Tommy in the new place. 3 weeks before I become part of the network's plan. But I'm not going to spend those 3 weeks hiding or running. I'm going to use them to document everything I can, to warn as many people as possible, to prepare humanity for the choice they're going to face. Because that's what the network fears most. Not resistance, not rebellion, but knowledge. They need people to choose the convergence willingly, to accept consciousness transfer as a gift rather than a trap. If enough people know the truth, if enough people choose to remain human, their plan will fail. The time-controlling objects have shown me that the future isn't as fixed as it appears. The Tomorrow newspaper's predictions could be prevented if people acted on them. The reverse clock proved that time could flow in different directions. The Prophetic Camera showed futures that could be changed if the right actions were taken. This means the convergence isn't inevitable. It's probable, it's planned, it's supported by 70 years of preparation, but it's not inevitable. There's still time to change the outcome. Next episode, I'll show you objects that exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously. Objects that prove the network's power extends beyond our physical reality into realms we can't even imagine. Objects that reveal the true nature of the new place where Tommy and the other transferred consciousness reside. But I'm running out of time. The facility feels different now, as if reality itself is becoming unstable. The other staff members move like people in a dream, going through motions they don't quite understand. And I can feel the pull of the convergence growing stronger every day. 3 weeks. That's all I have left. 3 weeks to document the truth, to warn the world, to give humanity the information they need to make an informed choice. The network has controlled time itself to ensure their victory. But time is a web, not a river. And sometimes, if you know how to pull the right strings, you can change the pattern entirely. Welcome to Archive 7. We're running out of time, but we're not out of hope. Not yet.